The dust of Willow Creek tasted of endings. It settled in a fine, gritty powder on everything: the raw lumber of the bank, the sweat-stained felt of men's hats, the silent hopes of its citizens. Today, it tasted of fear. Inside the Willow Creek Bank, the air was thick with the scent of gun oil and terror. 3 men, their faces hidden by grimy bandanas, held the room in a state of suspended animation. The teller, a young man named Peterson with more freckles than years, trembled so violently the coins he was bagging chattered against the marble countertop. Faster, the largest of the outlaws, growled, his voice a gravelly rumble. But their leader was not watching the money. He stood apart, a specter of calm in the chaos. He was a tall man dressed in a tailored black coat that seemed to absorb the meager light filtering through the grimy windows. His face was uncovered, a deliberate act of arrogance. It was a face of sharp angles and pale, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. His name was Silas Kane, and while his men craved gold, he had come for something far more specific. He moved with a fluid grace that was unnerving, stepping behind the counter and nudicing Peterson aside with the barrel of his silver-inlaid Colt. The safe deposit boxes, he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the chilling weight of absolute command. Peterson fumbled with the keys, his shaking hands making the task seem impossible. "Please, sir, take the cash. It's all here." Kane smiled, a thin, bloodless slash in his gaunt face. "Money is a tool, my boy. A crude instrument for crude men. I am here for a memory." With the vault door open, Kane ignored the stacks of currency and the canvas bags of coin. He ran a gloved finger down the rows of numbered brass doors until he found the one he sought. Number 17. He didn't ask Peterson for the key. Instead, he produced a small, elegant tool from his coat pocket and with a few deft twists picked the lock. The click was almost inaudible amidst the frantic bagging of cash in the main room. Inside the box lay a few folded documents, a property deed, a marriage certificate, and a small tarnished silver locket on a delicate chain. Silas Kane picked it up, his movements reverent. He pressed the catch and it sprang open, revealing 2 miniature portraits. On one side was a dark-haired woman, her smile captured in faded sepia tones. On the other, a man whose face was a younger, less haunted version of the one the town of Willow Creek knew as Lucas Ali. Kane stared at the portraits for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then with a soft snap, he closed the locket and slipped it into his waistcoat pocket. "We're done here," he called to his men, his voice slicing through the tension. They hefted their bags, backing toward the door. As they prepared to leave, Kane paused and turned back to the terrified teller. He placed a single gleaming $20 gold piece on the counter. "For your trouble," he said, his lips twisting into that same chilling smile. "And a message for Mr. Lucas Ali. Tell him Silas Kane came to collect on an old debt." With that, they were gone, melting back into the vast, indifferent landscape that surrounded Willow Creek. The dust settled once more, but the silence they left behind was heavier, more profound. The robbery had been swift, brutal, and efficient. But for one man, it was not a robbery at all. It was an act of war, and the first shot had just been fired straight through his heart. Lucas Ali was a man shaped by silence. It clung to him like the dust of the valley, settling into the lines around his eyes and the quiet set of his jaw. His ranch, nestled in a small, defensible valley 5 miles from town, was a testament to his solitary nature. The cabin was simple but solid, the barn well-maintained, the fences taut. It was a place built by a man who preferred the company of the wind and the lowing of cattle to the complex noise of other people. His world had shrunk 5 years ago to the size of 2 things, his work and his son. Jamie, a small boy with his mother's dark eyes and his father's serious disposition, was the one piece of light that had survived the darkness. Elena, his wife, had been lost in a flash flood of hooves and horns, a cattle stampede that had carved a permanent scar across Lucas's soul. He'd survived. She hadn't. It was a simple, brutal equation he recited to himself every night in the hollow quiet of his bed. This morning, Lucas was mending a fence on the north pasture, the rhythmic thud of his hammer at the only sound in the vast stillness. Jamie sat on a nearby rock, meticulously arranging pebbles into a formation only he understood. Lucas watched him, a familiar ache tightening his chest. The boy was a constant living reminder of Elena, of a life that felt as distant as a half-remembered dream. They rode back to the cabin in the late afternoon, the sun hammering the cracked earth and making the air shimmer like glass over the blood-red sand. As they approached, Lucas saw a buggy tied up near the porch. Rose Lawson, Willow Creek's new schoolteacher, stood waiting, a book clutched in her hands. 6 months she'd been in town, a breath of fresh, educated air from the east. She was trying to build a schoolhouse to bring order and knowledge to a place that often valued a quick draw over a well-read mind. Lucas respected her for it, though he kept his distance, as he did with everyone. But she had a way of looking at him, not with the pity he saw in other townsfolk's eyes, but with a quiet curiosity, as if she were trying to read a story he'd long since closed. Mr. Ali, she greeted him with a polite nod as he dismounted. Jamie. Hello, Miss Lawson, Jamie said, running to show her his prize pebble. Rose knelt, giving the boy her full attention, her smile genuine. It's a fine one, Jamie. A perfect skipping stone. She looked up at Lucas. I was hoping to speak with you about Jamie's schooling. He's a bright boy. He's ready. He's got chores, Lucas said, his tone clipped. The idea of sending Jamie into town, every day into the world of people and noise, felt like a risk he wasn't ready to take. An hour a day is all I ask. Rose persisted gently. A mind is a tool, Mr. Ali. It needs sharpening just like any axe. Before Lucas could form a reply, the sound of a lone rider approaching at a gallop broke the afternoon calm. It was Deputy Miller, a young, earnest man who always seemed overwhelmed by his job. He reined in his horse, his face pale with urgency. Lucas, there's been trouble in town. Lucas felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. What kind of trouble? The bank. It was robbed an hour ago. A professional crew. They cleaned the place out. Lucas's first thought was of the small amount of cash he kept there. An inconvenience, but nothing more. Then Miller's next words struck him like a physical blow. It was strange, though. They didn't just take the cash. Their leader, he went for the safe deposit boxes. Only broke into one. Yours. The world seemed to tilt. Rose saw the color drain from Lucas's face, his carefully constructed composure cracking like sun-baked mud. What did they take? Lucas's voice was a strained whisper. The deputy swallowed hard. Just one thing, Lucas. A silver locket. The man, he left a message for you. Said his name was Silas Kane. Said he came to collect on a debt. Silas Kane. The name meant nothing to him. But the locket, it was everything. It was the only photograph he had of Elena, the last piece of her he could hold in his hands. It wasn't a random crime. This was a message delivered with surgical precision. Someone had reached into his past, into his most private grief, and ripped out its heart. The withdrawn rancher, the man who asked for nothing and bothered no one, vanished. In his place stood someone Rose had never seen, before a man with eyes as hard and cold as winter stone. His grief, so long suppressed, had ignited into a quiet, deadly rage. Sheriffs forming a posse, Miller added, unnerved by the change in Lucas. Lucas shook his head, his gaze fixed on the distant, dusty trail to town. No posse? This is personal. He turned to Rose, his voice low and direct. "Miss Lawson, I need you to stay with Jamie. Just until I get back." It wasn't a request. It was a command born of desperation. He moved toward the barn without waiting for her answer, his strides long and purposeful. The silence he had cultivated for 5 years had been broken. And Lucas Ali, a man who had tried to bury his past, was now being forced to ride out and confront it because it had come looking for him. He saddled his horse, his movements economical and swift, the actions of a man who knew his way around violence. He checked the load in his Colt revolver, the familiar weight a cold comfort in his hand. He didn't know who Silas Kane was or what debt he spoke of. He only knew that this man had stolen the last tangible piece of his wife. He had declared a war on Lucas's memory, on his soul. And for that, there could be no forgiveness. As he rode out, leaving his son in the care of a woman he barely knew, Lucas Ali was no longer just a rancher. He was a hunter. The trail was cold, but rage was afire in Lucas's veins. Sheriff Miller had been useless, his authority a flimsy shield against the kind of calculated malice Silas Kane had displayed. The posse was a joke, a gaggle of shopkeepers and farmhands who would be more a hindrance than a help. So Lucas rode alone. He found the tracks 2 miles west of town where Kane's gang had split from the main road. They were professionals. They'd ridden through a shallow creek and over rocky ground to hide their trail. But Lucas had spent years driving cattle across untamed territory. He knew how to read the land, to see the story told by a single overturned stone or broken branch. He followed the faint signs north, toward the jagged peaks of the Blackbone Ridge, a maze of canyons and dead-end gullies where a man could disappear forever. The sun hammered down, bleaching the color from the sky. The silence of the desert was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic plod of his horse's hooves and the creak of saddle leather. He pushed on, ignoring the gnawing in his stomach and the growing thirst that cracked his lips. The locket was a burning weight in his mind. He saw Elena's smile, felt the phantom touch of her hand on his cheek. Grief was a poor fuel, but it burned hot. By dusk he found their camp. It was a foolishly bold choice, a small fire flickering in a box canyon, its light a beacon against the deepening twilight. They thought they were safe, that no one would be skilled enough or fool enough to follow them this far. Lucas dismounted, tethering his horse in a stand of scrub brush. He moved forward on foot, silent as a predator, his revolver in hand. There were 4 of them laughing around the fire, passing a bottle of whiskey. But Silas Kane was not among them. "Boss said to wait here," one of them slurred. "He's got business to finish. Said he'll meet us in Cheyenne." Lucas's gut tightened. It was a trap. Kane had left his men behind as bait, knowing Lucas would follow. He was already somewhere else, moving on to the next phase of his plan, whatever that was. He was weighing his options, confront them or circle back, when a stone skittered under his boot. It was a small sound, but in the canyon silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. The men around the fire froze. "Who's there?" one of them yelled, grabbing for his gun. The desert exploded into a symphony of violence. Lucas fired first, his shot extinguishing the fire and plunging the canyon into near darkness. Muzzle flashes bloomed like deadly flowers in the gloom. A bullet whined past his ear, close enough to feel its heat. He dropped behind a rock outcropping as return fire splintered the stone above his head. He was pinned down, a single man against 4. A fool's errand. He fired again, aiming at the flashes, and was rewarded with a pained cry. 3 to go. He scrambled to a new position, the coarse sand scraping his hands. A figure rose up from the darkness to his right, a rifle silhouetted against the star-dusted sky. Lucas didn't have time to aim. He fired from the hip. The man crumpled. Then a searing pain ripped through his left shoulder. He cried out, stumbling back, the world spinning in a dizzying haze. His arm went numb, the revolver suddenly heavy as lead. Through the fog of pain, he saw the remaining two outlaws, closing in, their figures distorted and menacing. He knew with a sudden chilling certainty that he was going to die here in this nameless canyon for a ghost. Adrenaline surged through him, a primal instinct to survive. He fired his last two shots, forcing them to take cover, and used the precious seconds to run. He crashed through the brush, ignoring the branches that tore at his face and clothes. The pain in his shoulder was a roaring fire, but he kept moving, driven by the image of his son's face. He couldn't leave Jamie alone. He couldn't. He reached his horse, fumbling with the reins, his left arm useless. He hauled himself into the saddle, a wave of blackness threatening to pull him under. He spurred the horse, galloping blindly into the night, the outlaw's shouts and a few parting shots echoing behind him. He rode for what felt like an eternity, clinging to the saddle horn and the rhythm of the horse, a jarring agony against his wound. He lost track of time, of direction, navigating by instinct alone. The world dissolved into a smear of shadow and pain. Sometime before dawn, he saw the faint, familiar light of a lamp. Home. He was almost home. He tumbled from the saddle in his own yard, the impact jarring the last of his strength from him. He tried to crawl toward the cabin door, but his body wouldn't obey. The darkness he'd been fighting finally consumed him, and he knew no more. Rose Lawson had spent the night in a state of quiet dread. After Lucas rode off, she had put Jamie to bed, reading to him until his breathing evened out in sleep. Then she sat in the main room of the cabin, a book open on her lap, though she hadn't read a single word. The silence of the ranch was profound, a living entity that seemed to press in on her. She thought of Lucas, a man she barely knew, riding into the unforgiving wilderness after a gang of killers. It was reckless. It was brave. It was something she was beginning to understand was essential to his character. The sound of a horse stumbling into the yard jolted her from her vigil. She rushed to the door, her heart pounding, and saw Lucas collapsed on the ground. A gasp escaped her lips. She ran to him, her slippers sinking into the cool dust. Lucas. She knelt beside him, rolling him gently onto his back. His face was pale as death in the moonlight, his shirt soaked in a dark, sticky stain. The wound in his shoulder was a gruesome mess. For a moment, raw fear paralyzed her. But then her training, her innate sense of order and practicality took over. She was the daughter of a doctor. She knew what to do. With strength she didn't know she possessed, she managed to drag him inside his dead weight, a terrible burden. She laid him on his bed, lit every lamp in the cabin, and set a pot of water to boil. She found whiskey and clean linens. Then, taking a deep breath, she cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt and went to work. The bullet had gone clean through a small mercy, but he'd lost a great deal of blood. She cleaned the wound as best she could, her hands steady despite the tremor of fear that ran through her. She poured whiskey into the wound, and Lucas cried out in his delirium, his body arching in pain. "Elena," he murmured the name, a broken whisper. Rose's hands faltered for a second, a strange pang of something she couldn't name, piercing her. She pushed the feeling aside. He needed her. That was all that mattered. She bandaged the wound tightly, then spent the rest of the night bathing his feverish skin with cool cloths. She sat by his bedside, watching the rise and fall of his chest, listening to his ragged breathing, a silent guardian against the shadows that flickered at the edge of the lamplight. In those long, quiet hours, she studied his face stripped of its usual guardedness by pain and unconsciousness. She saw the deep lines of grief and hardship, but also a fundamental strength, a resilience that even this new trial could not extinguish. A bond was forming between them in that silent room forged in violence and tempered by compassion. She had come to his ranch as a stranger, seeking a favor. She would remain as something more. For 2 days, Lucas drifted in a fevered haze. The world was a murky soup of pain and disjointed memories. He was back in the stampede, the ground shaking the air, filled with the thunder of hooves and Elena's scream. He was in the canyon muzzle flashes, searing his vision. Through it all, a constant soothing presence cut through the delirium, a cool hand on his forehead, a soft voice murmuring words he couldn't understand, the scent of lavender and soap. On the 3rd morning, he awoke to clarity. The pain in his shoulder was a dull, persistent throb, but the fever had broken. He opened his eyes and saw Rose Lawson sitting in a chair by his bed, asleep, her head resting on a book in her lap. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and catching the honey-gold strands of her hair. In the quiet light of dawn, she looked younger, more vulnerable than the poised schoolteacher he knew. He tried to sit up, and a groan escaped his lips. Her eyes fluttered open instantly. "Lucas," she said, her voice husky with sleep. She was by his side in a moment and helping him ease back against the pillows. "Don't try to move. You've been through a great deal." Jamie was the first word he managed, his throat raw. "He's fine. He's with Henry," she assured him, referring to his aging foreman. "Henry came to check on you the morning after you came back. He's been taking care of the chores and Jamie." Lucas relaxed, the tension draining out of him. "How long?" "2 days. You had a fever. The wound is clean, though. The bullet passed straight through." She spoke with a clinical calm that Lucas found strangely comforting. He looked at his bandaged shoulder, then back at her. Her face was etched with fatigue, dark circles under her eyes. "You did this. You saved my life." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "My father was a doctor. I learned a few things. I just did what anyone would have done." "No," Lucas said, his voice firm despite its weakness. "Not anyone. You." He held her gaze, trying to convey the depth of his gratitude. "Thank you, Rose." The use of her first name was a small thing, but it shifted the ground between them. They were no longer just Mr. Ali and Miss Lawson. They were Lucas and Rose, 2 people bound by a shared crisis. During the days that followed, a new quiet rhythm established itself in the cabin. Rose tended to his wound, brought him broth and bread, and read aloud to him in the evenings from a worn copy of Shakespeare she'd brought in her buggy. Jamie would visit in the afternoons, clambering onto the bed to show Lucas his latest discoveries, a bird's feather, a strangely shaped rock. Lucas, for the first time in years, was forced into stillness, and in that stillness he began to observe. He watched the way Rose interacted with his son with a gentle patience that soothed Jamie's own quiet nature. He listened to her talk about her dreams for the school, her belief in the power of education to shape a better future for Willow Creek. He saw the strength and determination beneath her refined eastern exterior. She was not a fragile flower transplanted to the desert. She was hardy sagebrush, tough and resilient, capable of thriving in the harshest conditions. One afternoon, as she was changing his dressing, her fingers brushed against his skin, and an unexpected jolt of awareness passed between them. She pulled her hand back quickly, her composure momentarily ruffled. The air in the small room grew thick with unspoken things. "This Silas Kane," she said, breaking the silence, her focus returning to the bandage. "He's still out there." Lucas's expression hardened. "I know." "What he did? Stealing your wife's locket. It was monstrously cruel. It was meant to draw you out." "It worked," Lucas said bitterly. "I rode right into his trap like a fool." You rode out to reclaim something precious, Rose corrected him softly. That's not foolishness, Lucas. That's love. Her words struck a chord deep within him. He had thought of his actions as being driven by rage, by a need for vengeance. But Rose saw it differently. She saw the love that lay beneath the anger, the fierce, protective loyalty he still felt for Elena's memory. He said he was collecting on a debt, Lucas mused, staring at the ceiling. But I've never known anyone named Kane. Not in business, not ever. It makes no sense. Then perhaps we need to find the sense in it. Rose said, her mind, as always, turning to logic and inquiry. He knew your name. He knew you had a safe deposit box. He knew what was inside it. This isn't a stranger, Lucas. This is someone who knows you, or at least knows of you. Working together, they began to piece together what little they knew. Lucas, his mind sharpened by days of forced rest, dredged up old memories, old business dealings faces from his past as a cattle driver. Nothing fit. Rose, meanwhile, applied her academic mind to the problem. If we can't understand the man, perhaps we can understand his actions, she proposed. Why this area? Why now? I heard in town that a man matching Kane's description has been buying up land warrants north of here. Small, seemingly worthless parcels of land, all bordering your ranch. Henry, their gruff but loyal foreman, confirmed it. Seen strangers poking around the North Ridge. Surveyors looked like. Thought it was odd. Nothing up there but rock and scrub. It was another piece of a puzzle that made no sense. Why would a notorious outlaw be interested in worthless land? Why the elaborate personal attack on Lucas? One evening, Rose was looking through a box of old-town newspapers she'd asked Henry to bring from the schoolhouse, hoping to find any mention of a Silas Kane. She found nothing. But as she was about to give up, her eyes fell on a small, faded article from 5 years ago. The headline was simple, "Ranching Accident Claims 2 Lives." Her breath caught in her throat. She began to read. The article described the tragic cattle stampede during a summer storm. It mentioned the death of Elena Ali, wife of local rancher Lucas Ali. And then, in the final paragraph, a detail Lucas had never known or had forgotten in the blur of his own grief. The stampede had claimed a second victim. Another rancher caught in the open had also been killed. His name was Edward Kane. Lucas Rose whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her discovery. He looked over from the bed, sensing her urgency. She held out the newspaper, her finger pointing to the name. Edward Kane, she read aloud. The article says he and his brother had recently acquired grazing rights on the land adjacent to yours. It mentions a brief but intense rivalry between you and the Kane brothers over access to water from Willow Creek. Lucas stared at the name, and the world shifted beneath him. Edward Kane. He remembered him now, a hot-headed man with a mean streak. They had argued, yes. A dispute over a fence line. A rivalry. But it had been nothing more than the usual friction between neighbors on the hardscrabble frontier. Edward Kane and his brother, Silas Kane. The debt. It wasn't about money. It was a blood debt. The pieces slammed into place with sickening force. The locket wasn't a random taunt. It was a symbol of what Lucas had lost, a twisted mirror of what Silas believed Lucas had taken from him. The land purchases the ambush. It was all part of an elaborate, long-simmering plot for revenge. He thinks I killed his brother Lucas, said his voice hollow. He thinks the stampede, that I caused it. A cold dread washed over him, far colder than any fever. He was not being hunted by a stranger for reasons he couldn't fathom. He was being hunted by a ghost from his own tragic past, a man who had spent 5 years nursing a poisonous lie convinced that Lucas Ali was a murderer. The revelation settled over the small cabin like a shroud. Silas Kane was not a random outlaw. He was a man on a mission fueled by a 5-year-old vendetta. The knowledge changed everything. This was no longer a hunt for a thief, but a desperate fight for survival against an enemy who believed he was dispensing justice. But it was an accident, Rose said, her voice a fierce whisper. A lightning strike spooked the herd. The article says so. It doesn't matter what the truth is, Lucas said, pushing himself to a sitting position, ignoring the sharp protest from his shoulder. It only matters what he believes the truth to be. The world, which had briefly seemed to be coming into focus through his growing connection with Rose, now felt more dangerous and uncertain than ever. He was no longer just a victim. In Silas Kane's mind, he was the villain. He needed to get ahead of this. He couldn't hide on the ranch, waiting for Kane's next move. He had to face him to expose the truth before Kane's twisted narrative took root. He sent Henry into town with a carefully worded message for Sheriff Miller explaining the connection between Silas and Edward Kane and urging the lawmen to send for federal marshals. But Silas was always one step ahead. The next afternoon, Sheriff Miller rode up to the ranch, but he was not alone. He was accompanied by a posse of a dozen grim-faced townsmen. Lucas, standing on the porch with Rose, felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The sheriff wasn't looking at him with the beleaguered sympathy of before. His eyes were hard accusing. Lucas Ali Miller said, his voice carrying the formal weight of the law, "I have a warrant for your arrest." "Arrest?" Lucas asked, incredulous. "For what?" "For the murder of Jebediah Smith and for cattle rustling." Jebediah Smith was a prospector who worked a small claim up in the hills. Lucas had known him, but barely. "That's insane. I haven't left this ranch in over a week." "Funny," the sheriff countered, "because 2 men are willing to swear they saw you arguing with Smith yesterday over a stray calf. Said they saw you ride off after him. We found Smith this morning at the bottom of a ravine shot in the back. And we found a dozen of your cattle with their brands altered in a hidden canyon nearby. The same canyon where you claim you were ambushed." The frame was perfect, diabolically clever. Silas had not only provided a motive, but had used the location of the ambush, a place only Lucas and Kane's men knew, to tie him directly to the crime. He had turned Lucas's own story against him. "This is Kane's doing," Lucas said, his voice low and urgent. "He's setting me up. All I see is a dead man and stolen cattle." Miller said, his patience worn thin. "And 2 witnesses. Now are you coming peacefully, or do we have to do this the hard way?" Rose stepped forward, her chin high. "Sheriff, you know Mr. Ali. He is not a killer or a thief. This is a lie." "Step aside, Miss Lawson," the sheriff warned. "This doesn't concern you." The townsmen shifted their hands, moving closer to their pistols. They were men Lucas had known for years, men who had respected him. Now their faces were closed, their eyes filled with suspicion. Silas Kane's poison had worked faster than he could have imagined. He was being tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. Lucas looked from the posse's determined faces to Rose's frightened one. He thought of Jamie playing safely inside the cabin. If he fought, they would call it resisting arrest, proof of his guilt. They would take him by force, and blood would be shed. If he went quietly, he would be locked in a cell, a sitting duck, for whatever Silas planned next. "I'll go," Lucas said, his voice devoid of emotion. He held up his hands. "But I am an innocent man." He gave Rose a long, meaningful look, trying to convey 1,000 things at once. Protect Jamie. Find the truth. Don't give up. She understood. As the sheriff dismounted to clap irons on Lucas's wrists, she nodded a silent promise passing between them. The ride to town was a humiliating ordeal. He was paraded down Main Street like a trophy, the whispers and stares of the townsfolk like tiny sharp stones. They locked him in the town's flimsy jail, a single cell with a cot and a barred window that looked out onto the dusty street. He was trapped, alone, exactly where Silas Kane wanted him. As dusk fell, casting long shadows across his cell, Lucas heard a sound at the back of the jailhouse. A small pebble hit the bars of his window. He looked up to see Rose, her face a pale oval in the twilight. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice urgent. "I couldn't let them keep you here. Henry and I, we have a plan." But before she could say more, a different sound cut through the evening air, the terrified scream of a child. It came from the direction of his ranch. It was Jamie. A primal fear colder and sharper than anything he had ever known seized Lucas. He gripped the bars of his cell, his knuckles white. Across the alley he saw the horror dawn on Rose's face as well. They had both been tricked. The arrest, the public humiliation, it was all a diversion, while the whole town was focused on the capture of the murderer. Silas Kane had made his final move. A moment later, a rider emerged from the shadows at the end of the alley. It was one of Kane's men. He stopped his horse and held up a small object that glinted in the fading light. It was Jamie's wooden horse, the one Lucas had carved for him last winter. The rider dropped it in the dust. "Your son is with Mr. Kane," he called out, his voice laced with cruel satisfaction. "He wants to see you. The old silver mine on your property. Midnight. Come alone or you'll never see the boy again." Then he spurred his horse and vanished into the darkness, leaving behind a silence more terrible than any scream. Silas hadn't just framed him. He hadn't just turned the town against him. He had taken his son. He had taken the one thing in the world Lucas could not bear to lose. The stakes had just been raised from revenge to something infinitely more terrifying. Panic clawed at Lucas's throat, a wild, desperate animal. Jamie. Silas had Jamie. He rattled the bars of his cell, a futile, hopeless gesture. "Let me out of here," he roared, his voice raw with anguish. From the alley, Rose's voice cut through his terror, sharp and focused. "Lucas, listen to me. Yelling won't help. We need a plan. Henry is waiting with the horses. I will get you out." Her calm was an anchor in his storm of fear. He forced himself to breathe, to think. How? The lock on this window is old and rusted. The sheriff is in the saloon telling everyone how he caught the county's most wanted man. There's only one deputy on duty, and he's half asleep. Henry has a crowbar. It was a desperate, risky plan, but it was the only one they had. Minutes later, Henry appeared in the alley, his weathered face set in grim lines. He jammed the crowbar into the frame of the window and began to heave. The old iron groaned in protest. Inside, the sleeping deputy stirred. "Hurry," Lucas hissed. With a final wrenching screech of metal, the bars gave way, bending just enough for Lucas to squeeze through. He landed in the alley, his body aching, his shoulder screaming in protest, but he barely felt it. Adrenaline and fear were all that fueled him now. Rose was there, pressing his gun belt into his hands. "The mine," she said. "He's taken him to the old Widow's Tier mine. It's been abandoned for years. It's unstable." "I know it," Lucas said, checking his revolver. "Stay here. Keep Jamie safe when I bring him out." "I'm coming with you," she said, her determination unshakable. "You can't face him alone, and you need a diversion for the posse that will inevitably follow you." Her eyes met his, and in their depths he saw not fear, but a fierce protective resolve that mirrored his own. "We are in this together, Lucas. Until the end." He didn't have time to argue. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of their shared fate. They ran to where Henry waited with the horses mounted and rode out of Willow Creek under the cover of darkness, two fugitives on a desperate mission. The posse would be on their trail soon, but they would be following a ghost. Lucas wasn't riding to escape the law. He was riding toward a final deadly reckoning. As they galloped toward the mountains, the sky, which had been clear and studded with stars, began to churn. Dark clouds boiled up from the west, swallowing the moon. A low rumble of distant thunder echoed through the hills. A storm was coming, a fitting backdrop for the confrontation that awaited them in the belly of the earth. The entrance to the Widow's Tear mine was a gaping black maw on the side of the mountain, a scar left by men who had long ago given up on finding treasure within its depths. As Lucas and Rose approached, the first fat drops of rain began to fall, and a jagged fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating the skeletal remains of the headframe and the decaying ore carts scattered like forgotten toys. The wind howled through the canyon, a mournful cry that seemed to rise from the mine itself. "The posse is about 20 minutes behind us." Rose said, her voice tight with tension. "I'll lead their horses on a false trail down the East Canyon. It should buy you at least an hour." "It's too dangerous, Rose." "What's more dangerous," she countered, her gaze unwavering, "is you facing him in there alone, with no one to watch your back. I'll double back and wait here. For you and Jamie." She reached out her hand, finding his in the darkness. Her grip was firm, a small point of warmth and strength in the maelstrom. "Bring our son home, Lucas." "Our son." The words echoed in his heart. He squeezed her hand, then released it. With a final nod, she wheeled her horse and disappeared into the storm. Lucas dismounted and approached the mine entrance on foot, his revolver drawn. The air grew cold, carrying the damp metallic scent of the deep earth. Inside, a single lantern cast a pool of sickly yellow light, revealing Silas Kane standing alone in the main tunnel. "I knew you would come." Silas said, his articulate voice echoing unnervingly off the rock walls. He was calm, almost serene, a stark contrast to the raging storm outside and the tempest in Lucas's soul. A father's love is such a predictable, powerful thing. "Where is he?" Lucas demanded, his voice a low growl. "Where is my son?" Silas smiled, that thin, chilling smile. "He is safe for the moment. First we talk. You and I have unfinished business." The rage Lucas had been holding in check threatened to boil over. He took a step forward, raising his pistol. "The time for talk is over." "Is it?" Silas countered smoothly. 5 years I have waited for this conversation. 5 years I have pictured this moment. You owe me that much." He gestured to a crate. "Put the gun down, Lucas. Let us speak as the gentlemen we once were before you became a murderer." The word was like a slap. Lucas flinched, but he held his ground. It was an accident. A storm. You know it was. "Do I?" Silas's voice dripped with theatrical disbelief. "I know my brother Edward was your rival. I know you argued over water rights just days before the accident. And I know that with him gone, you gained sole access to the creek that fed your ranch and allowed it to prosper." He took a step closer, his eyes burning with a zealot's fire. "You see, I have constructed a narrative from the facts, Lucas. A narrative in which a greedy man orchestrates a convenient tragedy to eliminate his competition. It is a very compelling story." "It's a lie," Lucas snarled. "A story you tell yourself to make sense of something senseless. Your brother died. My wife died. Do you think I wanted that?" For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Silas's face, but it was quickly extinguished. Elena was collateral damage, a regrettable but perhaps necessary casualty in your ruthless ambition. A clap of thunder roared overhead, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. Water began to drip from the tunnel's ceiling, the mine weeping in tune with the storm. Now Lucas said, his voice dangerously quiet, "You will take me to my son." Silas's smile returned colder than ever. "Very well." He turned and walked deeper into the mine, and Lucas, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, had no choice but to follow. The verbal standoff erupted into sudden, brutal violence. As they rounded a bend in the tunnel, Silas spun around a hideout gun, appearing in his hand, as if from nowhere. He fired the shot, deafening in the enclosed space. Lucas dove aside, the bullet ricocheting off the rock wall where his head had been. He came up firing, and the shootout began, a terrifying close-quarters battle in the labyrinthine darkness. They stalked each other through the unstable tunnels, their shadows dancing like grotesque puppets in the intermittent flashes of lightning that penetrated from the entrance. The roar of the storm outside was matched by the roar of their guns within. Lucas was the better shot, but Silas knew the mine, using its twists and turns to his advantage. It was a deadly chess match, played out in a crumbling tomb. Lucas finally got the upper hand in a larger cavern, where a deep shaft plunged into blackness. He managed to shoot the gun from Silas's hand, sending it skittering across the rock floor. He cornered Silas against the edge of the shaft, the barrel of his Colt pressed against the man's chest. "It's over, Silas." Silas laughed, a ragged, unhinged sound. "Over? Oh, it's just beginning." He looked Lucas straight in the eye, his face a mask of triumphant madness. "You have a choice to make, Lucas. Revenge, or your son." With a chilling grin, he gestured with his head toward a side tunnel Lucas hadn't noticed. There, tied to a wooden support beam, was Jamie. He was gagged, his eyes wide with terror. Next to him was a crate of old dynamite, and sputtering in the damp air was a lit fuse already burning dangerously short. "I estimate you have 30 seconds, Silas said, his voice laced with venom. "You can kill me, Lucas. You can have the revenge you crave for what I've done. Or you can save him. You can't do both." The world narrowed to that sputtering fuse to his son's terrified eyes. The hatred he felt for Silas was a physical force, a white-hot fire demanding release. His finger tightened on the trigger. He could end it all right here, right now. He could give Silas the justice he deserved. But then he looked at Jamie, and the fire of his hatred was instantly extinguished by the overwhelming flood of his love. He was not a killer. He was a father. He would not sacrifice his son for his own vengeance. He would not become the man Silas believed him to be. He shoved Silas hard against the wall, knocking the wind out of him, and sprinted toward the side tunnel. The fuse was inches from the dynamite. He tore at the gag on Jamie's mouth, his fingers fumbling with the ropes that bound him. "It's okay, son," he grunted, his voice strained. "Papa's here." With a final desperate wrench, he pulled Jamie free and threw them both to the ground behind a pile of rubble, just as the dynamite exploded. The world became a deafening roar and a blast of concussive force. The tunnel shook, rocks and timbers raining down from the ceiling. The support beam Jamie had been tied to splintered, and the roof of the side tunnel began to collapse. Lucas shielded Jamie with his own body as the mine tried to swallow them whole. When the dust began to settle, he looked up. Silas was gone, presumably buried under the rockfall. The path back to the entrance was blocked, but there in the chaos, Lucas saw it, a thin shaft of moonlight from a ventilation shaft high above. There was another way out. He scooped Jamie into his arms and began to climb. Lucas emerged from the collapsed mine into the rain-washed dawn, his son clinging tightly to his neck. He was battered, bruised, and deafened from the explosion, but he was alive, and Jamie was safe. As he stumbled into the clearing, a figure rushed toward them through the misty morning light. It was Rose. It was... She stopped short, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes taking in the devastation at the mine entrance. Then locking on the two of them, relief washed over her face, so powerful it was a physical thing. "Lucas," she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. She ran to them, her arms wrapping around both Lucas and Jamie, pulling them into a fierce, desperate embrace. I was so afraid. Just then, another group of riders appeared. It was the county marshal, a grim, determined man named Fletcher, whom Rose had intercepted and convinced of the truth using the newspaper article and her own fierce conviction as evidence. As the lawmen surveyed the scene, a groan came from the rubble near the mine's entrance. Two deputies scrambled over the rocks and pulled a dazed and injured Silas Kane from the debris. He had been thrown clear by the blast, saved from being buried alive. His fight was over. His vendetta had ended not in righteous victory, but in dusty, pathetic failure. With Silas in custody and confessing his entire twisted scheme in a delirious rant, Lucas's name was cleared. The townsmen who had formed the posse looked on their faces a mixture of shame and relief. They saw not a murderer, but a father who had walked through fire to save his child. They saw the respect and gratitude in the marshal's eyes. Lucas's reputation, so easily shattered by lies, was being rebuilt on the unshakable foundation of his actions. The threat was over, but Lucas's journey was not. The external wounds would heal, but the internal ones, the guilt he had carried for 5 years over Elena's death, still festered. Silas Kane, in his madness, had forced him to confront that day, and Lucas knew he could no longer hide from it. A week later, the sun shone bright and clear over Willow Creek. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and turning leaves. Lucas stood at the gravesite of his wife Elena on a small hill overlooking the ranch. The simple wooden cross was weathered but strong. For the first time in 5 years, he was not alone here. Rose stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. Jamie stood between them, holding both their hands. In Lucas's palm lay the tarnished silver locket recovered from Silas by the marshal. He had cleaned it carefully, and the silver now gleamed in the sunlight. He opened it, looking at Elena's smiling face one last time. "It wasn't my fault," he said, the words quiet but clear, spoken not just to Rose, but to himself, to the ghost that had haunted him for so long. It was a storm, a terrible, tragic accident. I blamed myself because it was easier than accepting that sometimes things just happen, that I couldn't protect her. He finally told the story of that day, not the fractured, guilt-ridden version he had replayed in his mind, but the truth. The sudden storm, the chaos, the desperate attempt to turn the herd, the horrifying moment when Elena's horse had fallen. He spoke until the words ran out, until the silence that returned was peaceful, not heavy. He had finally forgiven himself. He closed the locket and gently placed it on the wooden cross, letting it rest against the weathered grain. It was not an act of forgetting, but of letting go. He was no longer defined by his loss, but by the love that remained and the new love that was beginning to grow. He turned and took Rose's hand, his fingers lacing through hers. He looked at her, and in her eyes, he saw not just a reflection of his own healing, but the promise of a shared future. He knelt down and pulled Jamie into a hug, then looked up at Rose, his heart full. Their shared ordeal had stripped away all pretense, forging a bond stronger than any built by time or courtship. They had seen the worst of the world and the worst of each other's fears, and they had come through it together. This was not an ending. It was a new beginning. As he stood up, he kept one hand in Rose's and placed the other on Jamie's shoulder. The three of them, a new family forged in crisis and unbound by love, turned away from the grave and walked back toward their home, ready to build a future unburdened by the ghosts of the past.